A police officer shot a black kid's German Shepherd for no reason unaware. His father was an FBI agent. What happened next will leave you speechless. 18-year-old Marcus Daniels stepped outside the warmth of the afternoon sun. Matching his excitement, beside him walked his birthday gift, a striking German Shepherd named Max. The dog was a sight to behold, with a glossy black and tan coat, alert ears, and strong confident strides. Marcus had always loved dogs, and Max was the perfect companion, a gift from his father to celebrate his transition into adulthood. As they moved down the quiet neighborhood street, Marcus smiled. Proudly holding Max's leash in one hand, the dog walked obediently at his side. His tail wagging with enthusiasm, Marcus couldn't help but feel a swell of joy. He had already bonded with Max over the past few days, teaching him tricks and commands that showed how well trained and intelligent he was. The occasional glance from a passerby only added to Marcus's pride as they admired the magnificent dog. The peaceful walk was interrupted when a police cruiser slowed to a stop near the curb. Marcus glanced up at the vehicle, his steps faltering as the driver's door opened and a white police officer stepped out. Officer Ray Thompson was well known in the area. His reputation for arrogance and prejudice preceded him. Officer Thompson stood there for a moment, saying nothing. His gaze lingered on Max, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly as he seemed to admire the dog. The silence was unsettling. Marcus shifted his weight nervously but remained still, waiting for the officer to speak. Finally, Officer Thompson broke the silence, his tone laced with condescension. He tilted his head and asked, as though it were the most natural question in the world, who the dog belonged to and how much Marcus had been paid to walk him. The question stunned Marcus. For a second he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. "Nobody is paying me anything," Marcus said, his voice respectful but tinged with confusion. Officer Thompson's lips curled into a mocking smile. He crossed his arms as he repeated himself, accusing Marcus of walking the dog for free. Marcus shook his head quickly, his voice calm but firm. He explained that the dog belonged to him, that Max was a gift. The officer's smile only widened, his laughter erupting suddenly and echoing through the street. "This dog," Officer Thompson said between fits of laughter, his voice dripping with disbelief. "This amazing dog, how could someone like you afford him?" Marcus's grip on the leash tightened. Instinctively he frowned, his earlier excitement now replaced by a sinking feeling. He didn't understand why this officer was behaving this way. "He's mine," Marcus repeated, his voice low but steady. "My dad gave him to me." The officer's amusement vanished in an instant, his expression hardened, his laughter replaced with suspicion. "You're telling me you own this dog?" he demanded, stepping closer. His voice was sharper now, accusatory. "So you stole him then?" Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, the accusation sending a chill through him. He tried to protest, his voice trembling, but insistent. "No, I didn't steal him. He's not stolen. He's mine." Officer Thompson's movements grew more aggressive as he loomed closer. "If he's yours," he said coldly, his words carrying a challenge. "Prove it." Frustrated by the officer's refusal to believe him, Marcus knelt beside Max. He wanted to show how well trained the dog was, how connected they already were. With a calm but confident voice he issued one of the commands he had practiced with Max earlier that morning. The dog barked once, obediently and enthusiastically, just as Marcus had taught him. The sound of the bark seemed to trigger something in Officer Thompson. His hand shot to the gun holstered at his hip and he drew it instantly. His voice rose sharp and defensive as he accused Marcus of trying to sick the dog on him. Marcus's eyes widened in disbelief. "No," he shouted, his voice breaking with desperation. "It's not like that. You're misunderstanding." But Officer Thompson wasn't listening. The tension in the air seemed to spiral out of control, seeing the drawn weapon and the officer's aggressive stance. Max barked again, this time louder, more agitated. The loyal dog could sense his owner's fear and tried to respond, his body tensed as if ready to protect. "Marcus, stop!" Marcus yelled, panic seizing him as he pulled hard on the leash, trying to calm Max down. "He's not attacking you, please." The words were ignored. The officer's gun remained steady, his finger tightening on the trigger. In a split second the shot rang out. The crack of the gun echoed down the Street louder than Marcus could have imagined. Time seemed to low as he watched Max collapse to the ground, the life draining from the dog's eyes. Marcus dropped to his knees immediately, the leash slipping from his trembling hands. As he reached for his fallen friend Marcus cried, his voice breaking. Tears streamed down his face as he cradled the dog's head in his arms. Max's breaths came shallow and weak, and Marcus whispered apologies through his sobs, his grief too great to bear. The officer's voice cut through the moment, cold and accusing. You tried to make that dog attack me, Officer Thompson said flatly, as if his actions had been justified. You're under arrest for harassment and endangering an officer. Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. The grief and shock left him unable to respond as the officer grabbed his arm, roughly pulling him to his feet. The cold steel of handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Marcus barely registered what was happening as Officer Thompson led him to the police cruiser. His gaze remained fixed on Max, whose body lay motionless on the sidewalk. The dog's glossy coat no longer gleamed in the sunlight, and the street, which had been so full of life just minutes before, now felt silent and empty as Marcus was placed into the back seat of the cruiser. His sobs filled the enclosed space. The officer drove away, leaving behind Max's lifeless body to lie alone in the open air, a painful reminder of what had just been lost at the police station. Marcus sat alone in a cold, dimly lit holding room. His wrists, still sore from the handcuffs, rested on the table in front of him. The stark metal surface reflected the tears streaming down his face, but he couldn't stop crying. The image of Max, his loyal dog, his friend, lying motionless on the ground kept replaying in his mind. It was like a nightmare he couldn't escape. The sound of the gunshot echoing through his thoughts over and over again. The room was silent except for the occasional hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Marcus wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, his chest tight with grief and humiliation. Everything that had happened felt surreal, the baseless accusations, the drawn weapon, and now the shock of being treated like a criminal when he had done nothing wrong. The door opened and a uniformed officer entered the room. His expression was blank, his demeanor cold, as he dropped a folder onto the table. Without preamble he demanded Marcus's identification. Marcus, his voice shaky and barely audible, managed to respond. He reached into his pocket as much as his restraints allowed and handed over his ID. The officer took it without so much as a glance at Marcus, briefly inspecting the card before sliding it back across the table. I want to make a phone call, Marcus said weakly, his voice cracking with exhaustion and tears. The officer stared at him for a moment, then sighed. Without saying anything he left the room again, returning a minute later with a phone. He placed it on the table and unfastened one of Marcus's cuffs so he could dial. Marcus's hands were trembling as he reached for the phone, his fingers struggling to hit the correct buttons. After a few rings his father picked up. Marcus. Charles Daniel's voice was sharp, immediately alert. The sound of his father's voice broke whatever resolve Marcus had left. Dad, he sobbed, the tears falling harder now. They shot Max, the officer said. I made him attack, but I didn't. I swear I didn't do anything. He accused me of stealing him. And then Marcus's words caught in his throat as he tried to hold back his cries. There was a brief silence on the end of the line, followed by his father's steady voice, calm but with an undercurrent of fury. Where are you right now? Charles Daniels asked, his tone leaving no room for doubt that he already had a plan. I'm at the police station, Marcus replied in a whisper. Charles's voice sharpened further. Stay where you are, I'm coming to get you. Marcus nodded silently, even though his father couldn't see him. The call ended with a click and Marcus set the phone back on the table, his hands still shaking. The officer, watching him closely, didn't say anything as he cuffed Marcus's hand back to the chair and took the phone away for what felt like an eternity. Marcus sat alone again. The silence in the room became heavier, the hum of the lights louder, the clock on the wall seemed to move slower than it should. Every passing second felt like an hour, every noise in the hallway outside sending a jolt of hope through him that anyone was coming to set things right. Finally the sound of heavy Purposeful footsteps echoed through the station. The door to the holding room remained closed, but Marcus could hear his father's unmistakable voice booming. From the front of the station, "Where is my son Charles?" Daniel's voice rang out. With authority, the words sharp and cutting through the air like a blade. Officers nearby scrambled to respond. Their voices was hushed as they tried to explain the situation. It wasn't long before the senior officer on duty, Captain Harris, stepped forward to try to calm him. "Agent Daniels, please calm down," Captain Harris said, his voice plating as he approached. "What's the issue here?" Charles didn't waver. His tall frame was tense with anger. His face set in a deep scowl as he glared at the senior officer. "Where is my son?" he demanded, each word slow and deliberate. Captain Harris gestured quickly to the holding room's Humes. "In there." He was arrested for. Before he could finish, Charles cut him off. "For what?" "Explain to me why my son was arrested." Captain Harris's voice faltered slightly under the weight of Charles's glare. "The officer involved said he attempted to make a dog attack him," he replied hesitantly. Charles's expression darkened further, his voice a low growl as he spoke. "That's not what happened." He took a step closer to Captain Harris, his tone as sharp as ever. "My son called me. He told me what happened. Your officer accused him of stealing his own dog and then pulled a weapon. Who gave that officer the right to shoot an innocent animal?" Captain Harris looked taken aback but quickly tried to regain control. "I'll get Officer Thompson in here to explain himself," he said, his tone more cautious now. Moments later, Officer Ray Thompson entered the room. His demeanor was relaxed, his hands casually tucked into his pockets as though nothing significant had happened. He offered a slight nod to Captain Harris before turning to Charles with an air of indifference. "Care to explain why you arrested my son?" Charles asked, his voice steady though his eyes burned with fury. Officer Thompson shrugged. "Your kid provoked the dog to attack me. I shot it for my safety." End of story, he said flatly, his words dripping with self-justification. Charles didn't blink. "That's not what my son told me," he replied evenly, "and judging by the way you're talking, I think you're lying." The tension in the room thickened, but before Officer Thompson could argue, Captain Harris interjected. "Let's check the CCTV footage," he suggested, his voice cautious as he tried to calm the brewing storm. "It'll show know exactly what happened." Charles didn't respond to the suggestion, but his expression made it clear he wouldn't settle for anything less than the truth. He stood silently as Captain Harris gave orders to retrieve the footage, his sharp gaze never leaving Officer Thompson. The officer for the first time seemed to falter slightly under the weight of Charles's stare. In the quiet that followed, Marcus remained in the holding room, unaware of the confrontation taking place on his behalf. His mind stayed fixed on Max, his loyal companion who had only wanted to protect him. He closed his eyes as tears slipped down his cheeks, grief and helplessness weighing him down. Outside the room, however, Charles Daniels was just getting started. The senior officers gathered in a small dimly lit conference room where the CCTV footage from the nearby street had been queued up on a large screen. The tension in the room was thick as Charles Daniels, Officer Thompson, Captain Harris and several other personnel stood silently waiting for the truth to unfold. The video began to play, the grainy but clear footage flickering across the screen. It showed Marcus walking peacefully down the sidewalk with Max, the German Shepherd, happily trotting beside him on the leash. Marcus's posture was relaxed, his attention focused on his dog as they moved along the quiet street. Then the moment came. Officer Thompson's cruiser appeared on the edge of the screen, pulling up alongside Marcus. The officer could be seen stepping out of the vehicle and approaching the teenager. The footage didn't include sound, but the body language spoke volumes. Officer Thompson stood in front of Marcus, his posture towering and confrontational as he gestured toward the dog. The room remained silent as everyone watched closely. The video clearly showed Marcus gesturing back, likely trying to explain himself. The teenager's face, even in the low resolution, was full of confusion and tension. Max in the video stood calmly at Marcus's side, his tail swishing lightly as he waited for his owner's next command. Moments later, Marcus crouched Slightly issued a command and Max barked in response, a quick obedient action. Nothing remotely resembling aggression, but then Officer Thompson's reaction played out in stark detail. He reached for his holstered gun, his body language tense and hostile. The watching officers inhaled sharply as the footage showed Marcus flinching back in alarm. Max's demeanor changed as well. The loyal dog began barking defensively, sensing his owner's fear and the officer's aggression. The barking escalated, but even then the footage clearly showed the dog's restrained behavior. He didn't lunge, he didn't attack, and he remained on his leash. Then came the shot. The entire room stiffened as the video played the exact moment Officer Thompson fired his weapon. Max's body crumpled to the ground, the leash falling limply from Marcus's shaking hand. Marcus dropped to his knees beside the dog, his sobs visible even without sound as he cradled Max's motionless form. The footage ended abruptly, freezing on the image of Marcus kneeling on the sidewalk, his face hidden by the shadows, his shoulders shaking with grief. For a long moment no one said a word. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the screen as the still image remained. Charles Daniels stood at the front, his shoulders squared, his eyes locked on Captain Harris. His face was like stone, impassive yet brimming with barely restrained fury. The senior officer, Captain Harris, finally broke the silence. He cleared throat, though his voice carried a noticeable edge of discomfort. He turned toward Officer Thompson, his expression stern and unrelenting. Well, he demanded, does this match the story you gave me earlier? Officer Thompson shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the evidence. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced with visible unease. He opened his mouth as though to explain, but found no words. I thought you didn't think. Captain Harris snapped, his tone hardening. He jabbed a finger toward the frozen image on the screen. You escalated that situation. The boy didn't do a single thing wrong, and you shot an innocent animal in front of him. Officer Thompson dropped his gaze to the floor, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. It looked like the dog was going to attack. He muttered weakly, though his voice carried little conviction. Charles Daniel took a step forward, his presence commanding as he addressed the room. His voice was low and measured, but every word carried the weight of his fury. The footage speaks for itself, he said coldly. My son was walking his own dog, minding his own business. This officer profiled him, accused him of theft without cause, and drew a weapon on a loyal animal that was doing nothing but responding to its owner. And then he arrested my son for his own reckless action. As he turned his gaze directly onto Captain Harris, his sharp eyes piercing through the senior officer's discomfort. What are you going to do about this? Captain Harris straightened his back, his lips pressed into a thin line. He turned toward Officer Thompson with a look that left no room for argument. This is clear misconduct. You overreacted and you used unnecessary force, he stated firmly. You've disgraced this department. Officer Thompson's face turned pale, his mouth opening and closing as he fumbled for a defense. I thought I was in danger, he repeated weakly, though it was clear no one in the room believed him. Charles shook his head, his voice cutting through Thompson's feeble words. My son's life was never a threat to you, and that dog that was his best friend. His voice hardened further as he added, you don't get to hide behind excuses. Not this time. Captain Harris stepped forward, his decision clear. Officer Thompson, you're relieved of duty, effective immediately pending a full review of this incident. He announced you'll be suspended without pay while the department conducts its investigation. Officer Thompson looked stunned, as though unable to process the consequences unfolding before him. His shoulders slumped as Captain Harris's words sank in. Charles wasn't finished. He stepped closer to Captain Harris, his voice calm but deadly serious. Suspension isn't enough, he said. I'm filing a formal complaint for misconduct, negligence and false arrest. My son will not carry the weight of your officer's actions. Captain Harris nodded solemnly. Understood, Agent Daniels. The department will fully cooperate with your complaint and the investigation. With that, Charles turned on his heel and left the room without another word. Every officer in the room remained silent, watching him go outside. The conference room. Marcus sat quietly in the hallway, his head still hung low. When Charles approached, he gently rested a hand on his son's shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. Marcus looked up, his red-rimmed eyes meeting his father's. They saw the truth, Charles said quietly, his voice softening. This isn't over, but I promise you you're not alone in this. Marcus nodded, the faintest hint of relief flickering across his face, though Max's loss still weighed heavily on his heart. Knowing the truth was coming to light brought a glimmer of comfort. As they left the station together, Charles's resolve was unwavering. He would see this through, not just for Marcus but to ensure that justice was served. The case proceeded swiftly to court, where the events of that tragic day were laid bare for all to see. Marcus sat quietly alongside his father Charles in the courtroom, his shoulders tense as the proceedings began. Officer Thompson stood at the defendant's table, his face grim but defiant. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting the evidence. The CCTV footage now played on a large screen before the judge revealed every moment: the peaceful walk, the unprovoked confrontation, and ultimately the devastating shot that ended Max's life. The courtroom remained silent as the video played, the room heavy with the weight of what it showed. Marcus sat still, his hands clenched tightly in his lap as he watched the events replayed yet again. Though painful, the footage was undeniable proof of his innocence. Witnesses took the stand one by one, including Charles, who recounted Marcus's tearful call and the actions that led to his wrongful arrest. Each testimony added more weight to the truth. Dismantling Officer Thompson's initial claims, the prosecution painted a clear picture of prejudice, negligence, and unnecessary escalation. When Officer Thompson finally called to testify, his earlier arrogance had begun to fade. Under questioning, he tried to defend his actions, claiming that had acted out of self-defense and confusion. However, the footage and evidence left his arguments weak and hollow. The courtroom listened in cold silence as his justification unraveled further with each question. The judge, having seen and heard enough, addressed the room with finality. His voice was calm but resolute as he delivered his verdict. The court found Officer Thompson guilty of using unnecessary force and engaging in professional misconduct. Marcus's arrest was declared unlawful and all accusations against him were officially dismissed. Officer Thompson's punishment was clear: he was suspended from duty for 1 month without pay and placed under internal review with his future in law enforcement left uncertain. The judge's ruling, though measured, reflected the court's acknowledgement of wrongdoing. After the gavel fell and the proceedings concluded, Charles stood beside Marcus as they exited the courthouse. A quiet crowd had gathered outside, many waiting to hear the outcome. Reporters shouted questions, their cameras flashing, but Charles ignored them, keeping his focus on his son. Marcus walked with his head held high, though his expression remained somber. Charles placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder as they moved through the crowd. He leaned slightly closer and spoke quietly, his voice steady and reassuring. "We'll get through this," Charles said. His words were calm but filled with the quiet determination that had carried them this far. Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed ahead. Though the court's decision had brought accountability, it did little to ease the ache in his chest. Max's absence was a void that could not be filled, and the memory of his loyal companion's final moments weighed heavily on his heart. They reached a quieter part of the street, away from the noise and flashing cameras. Charles stopped and turned to face Marcus fully. "What happened to Max wasn't right," he said softly, "but we made sure they couldn't bury the truth that matters." Marcus swallowed hard, the grief still raw in his eyes. He met his father's gaze and nodded again, understanding the significance of what they had achieved. Together they had faced injustice head-on and fought to hold those responsible accountable. Able as they walked forward, father and son side by side, Marcus allowed himself a moment to breathe. Though Max was gone, the fight for justice had not been in vain. In a world where prejudice could steal so much, Marcus and his father had proven that the truth, no matter how painful, was always worth standing for. Disclaimer: this story is entirely fictional and created for awareness purposes. It highlights issues of accountability, Justice and the importance of treating everyone with respect and dignity. We stand firmly against violence, prejudice and injustice in any form. Viewer discretion is advised.